a day of the week that you're going to release. You want to release as early in the morning as possible. So we usually say schedule it for 3 a.m. And the reason for that is for scheduling at 3 a.m. is because you want to get people, no matter how early they get up, no matter what the routine is, you want to make it as easy as possible. And there's a fine line between, if you do it at 1 a.m., maybe it'll pop up on their phone just as they're going to sleep and they'll forget about it. But if you do it at 3 a.m., they'll see it as they wake up. Now, there are little crawlers in Apple that crawl for new podcasts every couple of hours. So it means that your podcast may not necessarily display for a couple of hours. So if you upload it at 3, it'll be there by 5. And hopefully most people get up after 5. So you want to do it 3 a.m., pick a day and release consistently. Honestly, there is nothing better you can do to promote and succeed in your podcast than be consistent. So your listeners know, on a Thursday when I am on the bus, this is what I listen to. This is what I listen to on a Tuesday. Just make it really easy for them. So once you have that and you said, right, I'm going to release every Tuesday at 3 a.m. And I'm going to stick to that. And then you want to go and find a platform. Now, obviously, I work for Acast. I think we have the best podcast platform. But when you are looking for a podcast platform, what you are looking for is a platform that is IAB certified, right? What does that mean? It means that there are filters and systems and certification in place to make sure that the insights that you're getting on your podcast are completely real, 100% true. So, for example, what would a duplicate listen look like on a podcast? So I've got a MacBook, right? And I've got an iPhone, and I've got an iPad, and I've got an Apple Watch. I just give Apple all of my money when I get it, right? So let's say I subscribe to a podcast, Tommy, Hector, and Larissa podcast, for example. I subscribe to that. All my Apple products are synced up. So I download it on my phone. Great. Then it goes on my laptop. Then it goes on my watch. Then it goes on my iPad. If you are with an IAB certified platform, that counts as one listen because it can recognize that it's one. All right. If you're not, it can count as 4 or 5 listens. And what's the issue with that? More listens? No. So if you are going to get your podcast sponsored and you're going to ask a brand to pay money to be associated with your podcast, and you're reporting to them how many listens you're getting, you want to make sure that those listens are as accurate as possible. Also for yourself, for your growth, knowledge is power, right? So the thing that is going to help you the most in growing your podcast is knowing where you started, knowing where you want to get to, and how the journey is to get there. So with a lot of the better podcast platforms, I'm going to just talk about Acast because it's obviously the one I know the best. You want really good insights. You want to see who's listening, where are they listening, ideally what age group are they in, what podcast app did they listen on, what time of the day did they listen, and some other good things you can find out as well are what other podcasts did they listen to. So that sort of stuff is really good for cross promo. You need to get to know your audience, and this is the best way you will get to know your audience. My little chat box is over the next part, and now I can't see what it is. Can anyone see what's under that?
It's getting your podcast heard everywhere.
Perfect. This is going to become problematic. So you want to make sure that you get a platform that distributes to all podcast platforms. There are so many of them. You've got Apple, you've got Spotify, we've got Stitcher, Castbox, the list goes on and on. There are so many of them. And you want to make sure that no matter if I have an iPhone and you have a Samsung, or somebody else has a HTC, or they're listening on a laptop, or they're listening, I don't know, on something else entirely, you want to make sure no matter where they're listening, no matter how they listen, it is as easy as it can be for them to hear your podcast. All right, so now you've got a distribution partner, and you have scheduled your episodes for 3 a.m. every Tuesday morning. You can see where your listeners are, where they're coming from. How do you promote it? How do you get your podcast to listeners? So it lives on the platforms, right? But I think it's probably fair to say people don't scroll through platforms day in, day out waiting for new podcasts. So you want to go to where they are. So for example, you can use a visual platform like YouTube or Instagram. Now we always say maybe think twice. If you're monetizing your podcast, think twice about putting it on something, putting a full episode up on YouTube, for example. If you're monetizing it through your platform and it's dynamic ads, usually they can't put those ads into your YouTube. So you want to put in clips. You want to use visual elements on Instagram and YouTube. And what that does is I'm sitting at home and I'm sort of absent-minded. What was it? Doom scrolling, so they're calling it. And I'm doom scrolling. And I see something actually quite nice. I see a nice podcast. And this is a really funny clip, really funny. Blah, blah, blah. Stopped, cuts dead. No, I want to hear the rest of it. And you make sure that you leave them wanting more and you tell them exactly where to go. So if I'm listening, if I'm watching this video and I am so into your podcast right now, I am ready. I'm ready and I'm going to listen to it right now. But there's no link. All you say is, hey, listen on Apple Podcasts. Great. All right. So I'm going to go to Apple Podcasts. I'm going to type it in. Oh, crap. What was the name? Oh, it was a typo. You want to avoid all of that. Paste a link profile, whatever it is, you know. You want to cover all your bases and say, like, listen, wherever you get your podcasts, it's available now on Apple, Spotify, whatever it is. But if you can paste links and make it as easy as possible, if I can be listening to your podcast within one click, then it's a winner. It's as easy as possible. If you have guests on your podcast, you want to make it easy for them to make it easy for other people to listen to your podcast. So what I mean by that is, let's say I have my podcast and I have a guest on, and that guest has 2.5 million Twitter followers, 3 million Instagram followers, right? I want to make sure that I can use their followers to my advantage and for the good of my podcast. So do I go to them and say, hey, will you tweet that you're on my podcast? Ideally not. What you want to do is you want to go to them and say, hey, thank you so much for doing the podcast. I'd really appreciate it if you could tweet about it or put an Instagram story to your audience. Here is a suggested video. Here's an audiogram. Here, and actually, I should have said audiograms are great visual elements you can make as well. It's a little, there's a couple of websites and snippers that will take a portion of your podcast, put subtitle, or put the text over it, and then turn it into a visual element. So if you want to give those to your guest, give them a quote to put up. Give them all the links. Type the tweet for them and send it. And so that makes it as easy as possible to make sure you are putting your best and their best foot forward. I cannot remember the amount of times I was on radio and somebody promoted that they were on the show and used the worst part of the interview to promote it. I don't know why it happens. I guess, we disagree on what the worst part is, but it's your podcast. You want to own your message, and you're owning your message and you're making it really easy for them at the same time. So it's a win-win. Other podcasts, there is no better way to promote a podcast than on another podcast, because podcasting is still a relatively new medium, believe it or not. And sometimes we're still trying to convert people to podcast listeners. We've all spoken to somebody who said, where do I get it? What is it? Can't be bothered with those things. Or whatever it is. Or I've never listened to a podcast. I mean, my dad still has a Nokia 3210. He's not listening to a podcast anytime soon, is he? So you want to, and also there is nothing wrong with trying to promote to those people. You should. But if you want to have the easiest cross promo, go to podcast listeners, go to people who already know and love podcasts. So have you got a comedy podcast? Great. What other comedy podcasts could I be on? Could I be a guest on? Could they be a guest on mine? Could I tell them that I'll send them a trailer? Can you play it for a month and I'll play your trailer on mine? There are so many things you could do. Feed drops are another one. Can I go to a really well-known comedy podcast and say, hey, I'll release an episode of your podcast on my feed and on my platform. Will you do the same on yours and introduce your audience to it? Top it, tail it nicely, saying, hey, podcast, we love to support each other. Here's a podcast I just think you guys will love. Enjoy it. Let me know if you love it. Go and follow them over on there. Follow, subscribe, whatever it is. It's a really effective way of promoting your podcast. Another thing is, podcasting is coming to the point now where there are loads of cross promo groups. There are Slacks for people to join. Now, I don't know where you'll find them. you have to search the deep web. But no, it's if you search things like on Facebook, search things like podcast promos, podcast creator groups. Online, if you search the same things, you'll come across that. And anyone who has a podcast, and podcasting, by the way, is a lovely space to be in. Everyone is very nice. For a lot of people, it's, it began or continues to be a passion project. It is we're all in this same growing industry together. So it's all very lovely and very supportive. So search online, find these groups. There's loads of closed Facebook groups. There's loads of closed Slack groups. So honestly, they are just and the beauty about those is you're not limited to your own connections within your own country. There could be shows from the US and you can extend to a US audience. There could be shows in Australia and you can extend to an Australian audience. You know what? If you end up with 50,000 listeners in Ireland, 50 in the UK, 50 in Australia, 50 in the US, there's 4 sponsors, and and all of a sudden you've got a very lucrative enterprise going on. Speaking of sponsors and money, there are 4 main ways that people can monetize a podcast. So it's ads. Ads are the standard ads, almost like the radio ads, right? We try not to use radio ads. We try to respect that most people are listening in headphones, and you know what? A lot of times radio ads are produced with the idea that you're going to be going for a cup of tea, or you're going to be running after the kids, or you're going to be in the car, so they're a little bit louder to try and grab your attention. Podcast, we know that a lot of people have Bose and Sennheisers and Apple AirPods, and we can't scream at them. All right, so we try to have nice, gentle auditory experiences, as Blind Boy would say. But those ads are voiced by voiceovers, like any ads you might hear on Spotify, YouTube, radio. Sponsors are a little bit different. If you listen to podcast, if anyone was a fan of Serial, S-Town, we've all heard this podcast is sponsored by Squarespace. That is the classic podcast sponsorship. So it's voiced by the host. At Acast, we're really we like to be really personal about our sponsors. So we don't like to give our creators scripts, because that would be somebody else writing the language that the creator communicates to their audience in. And quite simply, that is not the most effective way to do it. Nobody knows your audience like you. They're interacting with you on Twitter, Instagram. They will tell you if they don't like something. They'll tell you if they do like something. You get to know them really well. So I think telling somebody the main points that they need to get across in a sponsorship and allowing them to do that the way they feel will work best for the podcast is really important. We've also got branded content. Branded content is very similar to sponsorships, but it can be a little bit longer. It could be an entire segment. It could be an entire episode. It could be an entire series. There's some great podcasts out there by for example, Waitrose have made podcasts, and Now TV now have made podcasts. There are lots of great brands that have podcasts out there that are really, really good listens. But also sometimes they could come to you and say, hey, let's pick Super Value, for example. They could say, hey, we really want to get across this range we have. We'd love for you to come in store and spend the day, or whatever it might be. That would be what a branded podcast is. And then there's direct listener support. This is probably the one you'd be most familiar with is Patreon. So if you want an extra episode every week, go to Patreon. Blind Boy, if you want to support me for the price of a coffee, go to Patreon. We've got Acast Plus. If anyone here has listened to the Tommy Hector and Larita podcast, the Some Economist podcast, they are using direct listener support, where somebody can pay for an extra episode, or whatever it might be. Might be a series. If somebody's paying for extra premium content that you're putting in. Direct listening. Also, during the pandemic, there was a supporter feature where you could say, hey, I know you're struggling right now. Here, I'll donate, or I'll support by giving you that as well. So they're the 4 main ways of monetizing a podcast. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about now is around sponsorships, because sponsorships can be the most lucrative part. And I mean, it covers ads as well. But what I said earlier about knowing your audience, you got to use that. So, but you also got to know yourself. So you got to know yourself and you got to know your audience. So let's say somebody comes to me and they say, I'm going to, we've got a sponsorship for Arsenal Football Club, for example. I'm so lack of imagination. I'm looking out my window at an Arsenal sign. That's all I can think of. But Arsenal Football Club, for example. And I go, oh, I'm not really a football fan. They go, oh, but it's 15 grand. Part of me is tempted to go, we'll get to like Arsenal for 15 grand. But the problem is that I don't like Arsenal. I'm not going to like Arsenal, am I? And my listeners will know if I'm saying, yeah, Arsenal are the best football team. They kick those footballs really well. It's not going to be effective. It's not going to be engaging. Well, it might be engaging to an audience, but for all the wrong reasons. So really think about what it is that you like and want to support. Blind Boy loves being sponsored by Now because he loves the product. He loves the TV shows that they have. So, that's something he really loves. Your listeners are fiercely loyal. Podcast listeners are so loyal. It is unbelievable. It can be a bit more difficult to build up a podcast audience sometimes because you're not getting into a car and picking a channel. You're not sitting down on your couch and picking a channel. You're choosing to go into your phone, sort through the God knows how many apps you have, pick a podcast app and listen to that podcast. When they're in, they're in. They are so loyal. That is so important that you respect that loyalty, not only through the amazing content you've produced, the brilliant sound quality you've put through, but actually telling them that you like brands that you actually like. And in the same way, really think about what you don't like. Think about this, and this is really important for ads as well. Think about, am I a fan of gambling, for example? And if you think I'm not, I think gambling is absolutely fine. Brilliant. That is brilliant. That is suited to your podcast. If you're not so comfortable with it, are you comfortable telling your listeners to go to Paddy Power or whatever it might be? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Also, you've got to think about your podcast. Should there be an ad for Barbie dolls on a true crime podcast or whatever it is? Some things just don't sound right and some things need to be contextual. Is the audience who would be buying Barbie dolls listening to a true crime podcast? Maybe they are, but chances are it's probably not the majority. So you want to really think about stuff like that as well. And I don't know if you guys are going to be able to play the clips I have, but the thing that should be really important is that your podcast is really fun. You're making a podcast because you really like it, because you like to get your story across, because you like to be a creator. And monetizing it should be fun as well. It should be equally as fun. There are so many hilarious sponsor reads. We've had people tweeting us, asking us to get sponsor reads from Adam Buxton and Oatly, like back on the podcast because they're so funny. There's one of the best stories I heard from this was Adam Buxton had a sponsorship from The Economist a few years ago, and he decided, in order to make it sound really fun and engaging to his listeners, he'd pretend to be somebody called Sheila from The Economist, phoning Adam's manager, telling him, so tell them it's £1.99 a month. Tell them not to be too funny. Make it not shit, whatever. And he put on this really funny Scottish accent. He didn't know, and we didn't know, that the person who actually was going to approve that in The Economist was called Sheila. And it just ended up being one of the funniest situations. And then there's other things like a Now sponsor with Tommy Hector and Larissa, where they actually made up a Now TV song. There are so many good examples of these sponsorships being some of the best content that has been created, some of the funniest. When, we all have a favorite ad that we remember from our childhood or, whatever, and the jingles stick in our head. It's no different than that. If you want it to be engaging and effective, and also if you want to get down to the root of it, you want your advertisers to come back for more, make it good, make it fun, and make sure you actually like it. They are the very basics. I could probably talk here for another 4 hours. If there are any questions, please fire anything you have. But that is it for the moment.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. we have a couple. I just a question on there on what you were asking. Julie's asked, how do you cross promote if your own podcast doesn't have guests?
Oh, very easy. That's where trailers and feed drops come in. So I'm looking at two of myself. If you very often to get, I know you're looking at two yourself. If very often to get approval for a new feed on Apple, for example, you have to create a trailer for your podcast. And what the aim of that is in 30 seconds, tell us what your podcast is about, when it's going to be released, where we can find it, that sort of thing. You make similar things. Let's say if the Tommy, Hector, and Larissa podcast wanted to cross promote with the Blind Boy podcast, Blind Boy would make a trailer. Neither of those podcasts, well, have guests for you. Blind Boy doesn't have them very often. Tommy, Hector, and Larissa podcast never has guests. So let's say we want to promote Tommy, Hector, and Larissa podcast on the Blind Boy podcast. I'm going to refer to them as THL because that's such a mouthful. THL would make a trailer. It could either be, here's who we are, here's what we do, here's when you can find our podcast, please subscribe now. It could be clips of the funniest moments from all the episodes they've ever had. Blind Boy could do the same in the reverse, because he is guest, he could put the best guests he's had. The feed drops as well. The feed drops are, they're so easy and they're so effective. You're asking another podcast to release an episode of your podcast on their feed. I think the most important thing about cross promo is that you're willing to give as much as you get, so that it's a fair balance, and you're genuinely swapping listeners as well. If you think that there's a podcast that for example, if you've got 500 listeners on your podcast and 300 people have told you that they listen to this other podcast, it's probably not worth doing cross promo on that podcast because you share almost your entire audience. So you're looking for a podcast that is similar, that people will be interested in. Ireland, we're very, in the UK, for example, people tend to stick to a category. People listen to comedy podcasts, they listen to history podcasts, they listen to current affairs, and they don't blend over too much. In Ireland, we listen to everything. We're such a nation of audio lovers. So there is no reason your true crime podcast couldn't be, it couldn't do cross promo with a comedy podcast if the tone sounded right. You're a creator, in your gut, where it's going to sound right. So you don't have to have guests at all or presenter swaps or any of that.
Just to pick up there, Jennifer, one small thing, I guess starting out, people can become overawed by what's viewed as success and what's not viewed as success in terms of download numbers. So like over the last 2 to 3 years, most especially kind of since COVID, there's been an explosion of new podcast series and shows being released. And like, I think the overall market in terms of publications has grown from less than 1 million maybe podcast titles 2 years ago to, I don't know, well north of 2 million now, or heading for 3 or whatever. But so because of that, of course, there's a lot more choice for listeners. And so you have these, you have moving audiences, and because audiences are splintering out, you have shows that do super well. And then you have a lot of shows that are doing really well, lots of loyal fans, but are perhaps, smaller numbers. So just to give people, I guess, who mightn't be aware of numbers, like in your estimation, what's a good sized audience, like for a weekly show, what's a great size audience, and what's a super duper in terms of weekly or monthly listeners?
Yeah, it all depends on where you are in your podcast's lifespan. Seems like the wrong word, but it all depends on where you are. So if you've only released 2 episodes, you can't, as I said earlier, podcast audiences they can be hard to come by, but once you get them, they're very loyal. So, and we all say those middle podcasts are the heart of podcasting. They're the ones with the most loyal listeners at times. They're the ones most engaged with their listeners. They can be the ones that are most valued to their brands as well. And the best for the podcast industry, because they come at it with such love and passion as well. So I would always say, give it, you've got to give it time. it could be, there are some things that are almost immediate successes, right? True crime tends to be one of them, but sometimes if it's very grisly, it can be a little bit harder to sponsor, right? So let's say we have a football podcast. That's not because I'm looking at the Arsenal side, it's an actual example. Football podcasts do very well. There are a huge amount of football fans. We could see a football podcast do, 500,000, 1 million listens a week, and it would probably get there, within a year or two. There could be a fiction podcast that's a bit more niche that only does 10,000 a week, for example, because it's more niche. But there are less of those, so those advertisers can flock to them a little bit more. I would say in order to see notable income, reliable, notable income that might be, a small to medium salary every month on your podcast, you'd want to consistently doing more than 20, 30,000 listens a week. I know that number can seem really big, and it does not take nobody gets there quickly. Nobody. You have to work at it. In terms of middle ground, sort of 50 to 75,000, that would be a very nice salary. And the giants, we kind of call a giant anything over about 200,000 a week. There are some podcasts doing 1 million a week. There are some podcasts that are released every day that are doing 10 million a week. It is huge. And I always say this: don't be overwhelmed and don't be afraid by the amount of podcasts that are out there. You have something to say that nobody else has to say. And the example I always use is there are millions of songs in the world, and you listen to them over and over again, and still millions of songs continue to come out over the years. Podcasts, people listen to an episode once usually, unless it's something like West Cork or Serial where you can actually listen to people. They're really rare examples, and I think it's really rare podcast nerds that actually do listen to them over and over again. But if music works, it continues to work, and it continues to be lucrative, don't be overwhelmed by the amount of podcasts out there.
Fantastic. So there's been a couple more questions coming in there. Damien has asked you, Jennifer, have you any suggestions for complete beginners, especially around the area of cross promotion? He said, I guess you need to approach people who are also starting out, and you probably need a minimum number of quality episodes before you think about monetization.
It depends. I mean, you can start monetizing from one listen. Just obviously the money you're getting won't be massive. In terms of cross promo, you would be surprised how everyone's probably been on the same road as you're on now. So there is no harm in reaching out to a successful podcaster and say, hey, is there any chance you consider this? The worst they can do is say no. The best they can do is actually feature you, and your podcast could blow up. Everybody has started out and everybody has been on the same road. There's also things like if you have a podcast with 2,000 listens and you're asking a podcast with 10,000 listens to promote you, and you want to be equal, all right, they promote you for a week, you promote them for 5 weeks, equal, sorted. You've gotten the same amount of listens and everyone's heard the same amount. So there are loads of ways around it. Don't be afraid and just go for it.
And Jennifer, do you recommend somebody create a couple of episodes before they launch one, that they maybe have 4 or 5 recorded?
Yeah.
Okay.
I do for a couple of reasons. First, you're going to end up recording one that you hate, and it's probably going to change all of your plans for your podcast. 2, it can be a lot, like the creative industries are really draining and they're really hard. And having to produce an episode every week without a break can be difficult. So before you start, let's say if you're going to do a series of 12 episodes, before you start, have 6 done. Then you can get the other 6 done, and then you can go on a break. And then if you go on a break for 12 weeks, you can take a 6-week break, and then you can spend the other 6 weeks getting them up. And, you just want to look after yourself and make sure you're giving yourself time to enjoy your podcast success as well. Sometimes when you're working in an industry, it can be hard to enjoy it. if you're not enjoying it. And what I mean by that awful sentence is, if you work in radio, sometimes you usually get into working in radio because you love it. Sometimes if you're not loving working in radio, it can be hard to enjoy it then as a consumer. Sometimes if I've had a really, really busy week, a podcast is the last thing I want to listen to. It doesn't happen very often, thankfully. It's, as I said earlier on, it's a genuinely lovely industry to work in. So I'm, lucky that I get to enjoy the thing that we're in, but it doesn't always happen. If you get really stressed, you're not feeling it for whatever reason, I guess, has let you down, your audio, your audition has crashed, here is not, it's overheating, which mine is actually doing right now. This sun is not doing it any favors. You may not want to listen to a podcast that week. So give yourself a break and just give yourself time. And, space is great for creativity as well.
I'm sure, Liam, you've had a couple of experiences with that, with having to get things out of deadlines. And
yeah. I mean, I think that kind of, it's really worth remembering what Jennifer says. It's so important to try to be able to enjoy it. Obviously, you're going to have frenetic periods in any production, especially if it's a limited series, for instance, or a true crime series. And they can be draining because of the subject matter too. But the further ahead you can get, definitely at least half your series of whatever duration, if it's 3, 6 or 12 episodes, if you can hit the ground, if you can have them in the bank, it gives you a thing. Because once you release that first episode, going back to Jennifer's original point of sticking to your release schedule, day, time, week, that is a ticking clock. The minute you release one, you're locked into the rest of your schedule. And that can actually become overwhelming as a maker, and it interferes with your storytelling, because you're starting to think about this other stuff and you feel this impending, oh geez, the world closing in on you. So the kinder you can be to yourself, it's all about planning. I think, Jennifer, that's one of the big things in podcasting is, radio, like FM schedules, they have a schedule and you plan ahead and you forward plan. And you must do all of that and more, I think, in podcasting, because a lot of the time in podcasting, you don't necessarily have a team to back you up, especially if you're starting out as a small time podcaster. It's you, and if you're lucky, one other person maybe helping you out. But yeah, just give yourself every opportunity to get the best content out.
Podcasting and radio are different in all the best ways. I think you don't have a grueling schedule. You're answering to yourself. You're usually your own boss with this stuff. I mean, as Susan said, I used to work in radio, and I was on a very popular mid-morning show, and I found it completely overwhelming, just the constant next, and the point where I knew that I needed a career change is when I heard myself on the phone going, oh God, and you've 19 grandchildren, Jesus, that's mad. And then at that point I realized I'd had her on before, and I thought, I don't care, I just need to fill a slot. I'm going to have her on again and pretend I didn't realize. It can be really hard, and that's where your quality gets obviously the quality gets sacrificed when it's just too much all the time. You want it to always be about quality and not quantity. The quantity has to be there too, but you just need to give yourself space to make sure that comes easy. You are your own boss in podcasting, and enjoy it.
Yeah, and just on that, in terms of the radio, you can build in a break to your season for whatever reason. I think the key thing is, and especially considering that podcast listeners generally tend to be more loyal, is tell your audience, just tell them what the score is, that you're absolutely overwhelmed, or you're beat up, or you're tired, or you've something big coming up in your life or whatever, and just say, sorry, can't do next week, but it'll be back. Just communication. And I think that's fine. What's really detrimental in podcasting and building audiences is when you're unpredictable. And you lose a schedule, and it's like, oh, I thought they were releasing on Thursday mornings, no sign, no explanation, no communication. You might get away with it once. If you do it a second time, game over.
Yeah, exactly. And also, doing it in seasons, I always say to people, if you're going to commit to doing a weekly episode, you better tell me now that you are going to release that every single week. I don't care if your dog gets hit by a car, your granny falls down the stairs. I'm sorry, life is going to happen. But if you think life is going to happen, please do it in seasons. For you, for your dog, for your granny, please do it in seasons. So you have the opportunity to care for them if you need to. And honestly, seasonal podcasts can be such a good promo tool, because if all of a sudden you have a renewed thing to say when you're promoting it, back for season 2, you're promoting season 2, season 3, season 4. You can do themes, you can do, you can respond to what's going on in the world. It can be like, it's a fresh way to promote. So don't think of it as, do think of it as, I'm going to do this to give myself space, but you can also say, I'm going to do this because it is so beneficial to my podcast.
Okay, good. There's lots of questions coming in here, so I'm going to just try and get through some of these with you quickly. Sarah's asked, I think I know the answer, but anyway, sorry, I'm getting an echo there. Yeah, so Sarah's asked, what platform do you like or use most? Apple, Spotify, or other? Is there a cost to uploading a podcast if you do not have sponsors, and how does that work? Great question.
So you upload your podcast to a host, which is what Acast is, and they will distribute your podcast to all platforms, i.e. Apple, Spotify, whatever. Apple is the most popular one that people listen to, more or less across the world. A lot of people listen on Apple Podcasts. There is usually a cost to uploading your podcast depending on where it is. Sometimes, I know with Acast, for example, you can start out for free, and if you have one show, you can go for free. If you want to get extra features, you can pay a little bit more monthly, or you can pay yearly up front. I actually, if you all want to write this down, I can give you a discount code to get 3 months free on Acast if you want it. So
wow, that's okay. Well, I'll put it into the chat box. What is that?
It is IE-VIP.
Can you say that again, Jennifer?
I can type it here. IE-VIP. There you go. If you use that on Acast, you'll get 3 months for free. But what the cost is otherwise, I think it's about 15 quid a month. With us, maybe you probably get it for a tenner a month. Some places you get it for free, but you just want to make sure that a lot of those places, as I say, you can actually get a basic one on Acast for free, but maybe if you want to use some promo tools and stuff, you'll want to get the extra. So that's what you're paying for. Some of them are free, but they won't be IB compliant. They won't really help you. They won't 24-hour support. Some of them might actually be a music platform that just hosts podcasts. It's not hugely expensive. But again, sometimes you might just need to get started, and the free one is the best place to start. It's all a balance about what's most important to you. When you are advertising, generally it's a revenue share if you've got a sponsor. So if somebody sells your sponsor for you, you might share it 50-50, 60-40 to you. It all depends on how good a negotiator you are and what the situation is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jennifer. And that code is there for anybody who's looking for that IE-VIP. Next is Damien. I think you're on the list here. Any suggest? Oh no, so we've already gone through that. So it's Julie. This is a question about the release schedule. If you don't have the capacity to have a weekly show, I know it's possible to still stay consistent by releasing every other week or even monthly, but I'm wondering if it would be better to instead have a season-based format, example, waiting to start releasing until I have a whole season ready so that I can release weekly and then take a long break between sessions. Do you think one of these formats is preferred, or does it depend on the type of podcast?
The latter, all day long, the latter. Wait until you have a season and release it. We are creatures of habit. We need to do the same thing week in, week out for it to become a proper habit. If you release every second week, you release every month, you are immediately lowering the audience that you're going to receive. Absolutely. We always say minimum 12 episodes in a season, maximum 16, maybe 20 at a push. But let's say you do 16. You take 12 weeks off, you get your next 16 episodes up, and then you do, this is where my bad maths is going to show up, 2 seasons a year, 3 seasons a year? Anyway, however many that fits in, 2 to 3 a year. and use all those opportunities, get the quality out, give yourself a break. Don't underestimate giving yourself a break in the middle of the season. And use the opportunity to promote coming back for another season. As Liam said, just keep your audience up to speed. Push them to subscribe and to follow so that they get a notification or an automatic download when you come back for a season. Don't say, I'm going to be back on the 14th of July. Please remember, come find me. You want to make sure they are subscribers, they are following, they have all the information, they know where to find you. But if they somehow forget, that little notification pops up on your screen because you've uploaded at 3 a.m. It's come on Apple at 5. It's automatically downloaded. You've got that little notification, and it's all really easy for them. So I would always say 2 things, and I didn't say this one earlier, but 2 things. One is weekly releases in seasons is much better than releasing every second week or once a month. And always release on a weekday. Never release on a weekend, because people are busy, they're doing things. Less people listen to podcasts on weekends in general. So you want to make sure that you're releasing to the biggest possible audience. So you want to release to a world of 15 million listeners instead of a world of 5 million listeners. So you always go weekly, in seasons, or weekly. If you don't anticipate your granny falling down the stairs, and don't release at weekends.
Did you say an ideal number of episodes in a season, Jennifer? Sorry.
Yeah, so again, it's all about habit building again. So you want to make sure it becomes a routine. So I would always say minimum 12, probably maximum 16. So somewhere in that sweet spot.
Brilliant, thank you. So, and then Damien was asking if you have any thoughts about shorter versus longer episodes. Kitchen Sisters do about 20 minutes, but many makers choose 45 minutes or an hour.
It depends on the content. So again, this is another place where podcasting differs from radio. I don't know how many 25-minute interviews I had to cut down to 6.5 minutes over the years. The answer I would give to this is as long as it needs to be, and not 1 single second longer. And what you're doing is, the guys from My Dad Wrote Porno have a great have a great quote around this. They said, if you're going to ask your audience to listen, if we're going to ask our audience to listen to us week in, week out for 30 minutes, we have a responsibility to make sure it is the best 30 minutes we can give them. So for example, if you're aiming for 45 minutes, but your last 15 minutes is horseshit, maybe cut it out or release something at 30 minutes. You're better off giving the best quality. Some podcasts have that as their thing, like the Smart 7, for example, 7 stories, 7 minutes, every 7 days a week. Great. Some podcasts are in-depth interviews, and it makes sense for those to be longer. So it completely depends. I would say if it's a longer form and its niche isn't that it's really short, then you want to do at least 20 minutes, because then if you get to a stage where you have advertising, you have a chance to have a mid-roll that's not coming in too quickly after your pre-roll ad or whatever it is. So you want to protect that listener experience and make sure the overwhelming message they're getting is your lovely podcast, and they're not inundated with advertisers. So I would say if it is a normal long form podcast, it's an interview, it's a true crime series where you're trying to tell a story, probably minimum 20 minutes, but don't be afraid to go as long as it needs to be. Tell the story, use the medium. And I when I worked in radio, my old boss had a saying that was, the listener won't miss what they never heard. And I actually think it's one of the worst things you could come at audio by saying, because you're giving them something. So don't think about them not missing what they won't hear. Give them what you really want to tell them. And that's, always have that in mind. If you have 1 week that's 45 minutes and your next week is 20 minutes, as long as they're your best 45 or your best 20, absolutely fine.
Okay, so you don't think it's so they don't have to be the same length every week, do they? Every episode or every episode?
No, I wouldn't say so. As long as if you're getting it across the way you need to. If it's normally 45 minutes, but this particular part of the story, and let's say you're telling a true crime story, you're telling it in sequence, this particular part of the story deserves its own episode but doesn't quite make up the length of the 45 minutes you've had until this point, you're better releasing that standalone and strong than adding or trying to, you know, I've normally I don't know how many times in like college and stuff I copied, like I inserted little silences just to make something a little bit longer. You don't need to go down that road.
On that, Jennifer, Sarah has asked, it might be actually one of Acast, one of your guys, she said many successful podcasters like My Favorite Murder or Nicola Talent have a very similar presentation style and episode format. So is this best? And no matter the individual story differences, do you try and make your series sound style consistent?
Yeah, I would, because that's part of what your listeners love. So for example, My Favorite Murder, they have an interesting style. So they're literally talking about their favorite murder or murderer, which is an interesting way to come at true crime. It's very different. So that, you know, it's good in that way. But you know, Nicola Talent, actually, let's like, if we take The Witness, or we take let's take The Nobody Zone as an example. If Doc and One were coming out a podcast and talking about why they love this fella who apparently, you know, was maybe a murderer, it wouldn't sound as good. So for example, My Favorite Murder have their own sound, and that's what people know they're getting every week. We think of Last Year Life with Darren Garahy. She asks the same set of questions every week, right? People know what questions you're going to ask, but they come for the feeling, and they come for the I really don't want to use the word vibe, but it's the only thing that's coming into my head, so they come for that. So I would say, yeah, every show should have its own sound. But I wouldn't worry too much, because that tends to come naturally. That's where it comes from your personality. It's where it comes from your editing style. It's where it comes from your narration. But I would definitely, you don't want somebody to tune into your podcast and go, what am I listening to? What is this? You want them to know it's you.
And like, just pick it up on that. Like, it's not too dissimilar to musicians. Like, you will grow and develop as a podcaster as you grow into the medium. And like a U2 album in the 1980s, they might have the same riffs, the same, you know, tone, but like a completely different sound in a way, like much more modern and so on. So like, I think it's important to have an imprint, but like, you will develop. So I don't think it would be good to feel shackled either, you know, like your accent, for instance, will be a sound, your vocabulary, your, you know, your approach, the way you ask questions, the way you react, those things you won't lose, because you can't lose. They're part of you. So you take those bits, but your production might change, the sound of it. You might come up with a new theme tune, or, you know, so I mean, it goes back to what Jennifer says. It's your podcast. So you're the king of it. Like, you're the content creator.
And your audience is going on that journey with you as well. Remember, once they're loyal, they're there. They're hearing you develop. You know, as we grow, we change. The first episode of the Blind Boy podcast was where he read short stories from his book. Now he talks about, you know, everything. He's, you know, having the biggest mental health conversation in Ireland. I mean, there could not be. Who did he see? He interviewed Spike Lee as he went to London with a Tupperware box of his mom's scones and fed them to Spike Lee on a stage. How different is that from reading a short story from your upcoming book? It's still Blind Boy. It's still the same sound. It's still, you know, we're still getting every beautiful facet of his personality. So don't be afraid to change, because also maybe when you start your podcast, it isn't working and it isn't getting that many listens, and you want to try and adapt and change and grow. But, you know, as Liam said, it's still your voice. You'll still have a style, a presentation style. You'll still have an editing style. You still have all those things. So I would say it is important for every podcast to have its sound, but it'll come more naturally than you think.
And I have a question. I don't know, maybe this might be more for you, Liam, around, because you're often talking about pacing, and since we're talking here about serial, you know, with true crime, would you think that people should be thinking about whether they're going to have mid-roll ads or things like that in their podcasts before they create them, in terms of then how you're pacing the podcast? Or
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's kind of going back to planning, and it's no different to say EastEnders or Coronation Street. You know, if you have a mid-roll ad, well, think about what would be, you know, a good reason for a listener to come back. Like, if it's more a talk podcast, it depends on the duration. If it's a 10-second mid-roll, it's largely non-interruptive. If it's a 30-second or a minute, you might ask a question which is only answered after the ad. So like, you play to whatever you're dealing with in terms of the content, in terms of the flow. But yeah, I mean, there's, in terms of pacing, like, I think what's noticeable, and Jennifer, you might know more about this, but like in general terms, you notice different pacing in different parts of the world. So like, for instance, Scandinavia is really slow, like it's Scandinavore, and it's not just in podcasts, it's in how they talk, it's in their television, their film. Then in the States, you might, like in the South, you might have slower drawl, like we had in S-Town, for instance. You might have very upbeat pitter-patter in, downtown Bronx or New York, or over in Australia. It can be either way again. So like, I think it's important. Like, I suppose one of the things I love in stories and in podcasting is the thing that I love in people, in that if I meet you, I love to know where you're from just engaging with you. So the sound of you, what you look like, you're from somewhere, like everything is local in a way. So if you're like making a podcast in the Bronx, like you should, and you're from the Bronx and you grew up in the Bronx, that's what you should be hearing. So you're not trying to be and talk like someone else. Like, so much of the world, as we know, has become homogenized. This is a whole other conversation. But like, what podcasting does is, at the flick of a button, like in a single device, in a single location, you can travel the world and you can encounter all these different types of storytelling and types of stories and types of people and interests, and and that is the wonderful kind of palette of content and engagement that podcasting offers, over and above, I would say, a TV. You know what I mean? And the visual. And of course, you can be doing other things like planting your greenhouse, going for a run or a walk, or your commute or whatever it is. So you can fit these things into your lifestyle as well.
It's funny you say that. I'm a really shit runner. I'm a really slow runner, so I can't listen to like upbeat music because I always feel like it's faster than me. So I like always listen to slow podcasts so that I feel like I used to listen to the Nobody Zone when I was in Dublin running around Stephen's Green, and it was fantastic because it was always faster than the because it was so lovely. And like to what you said, it introduces us to so many different areas. Like, I remember listening to the first episode of Blind Boy and having to Google what yurt meant, because it was a Limerick word I'd never heard before. Now, I'm Irish, we're technically from the same country, but I know now, and it's the same. It is lovely. And it comes to, when you're releasing a podcast, always remember that your target audience, if your podcast is an English language podcast, your target audience is the entire English speaking world. It's not your county, your town, your country, the entire English speaking world. Put your best foot forward and let them know who you are, and as Liam said, where you're from and what it's about.
Thank you, Jennifer. And listen, we'll wrap it up now. I know we've run over a bit of time. I knew there'd be lots of questions for you this evening. Jennifer, just on a final note, this thing around getting started and doing it, and what stops people getting started doing it. And I see just some of the other questions coming in. It's around, maybe being embarrassed, or how you feel, when you hear your first episode. Like, how do you motivate or encourage people to kind of just get started?
And you pick up your phone and you open the voice notes app, and you hit record, and you record what you think you want to talk about, and then you listen to it after, and then you go, oh Jesus, no, I can't, that's awful, I can't do that. And then you go back to the drawing board, and then you do that 5 more times, and eventually you're gonna hear something back. Firstly, when you hear your own voice for the first time, it is shocking. But when you do that 4, 5, 6 times, you're gonna listen and go, that was all right. And then you found your sound, then you found what you want to talk about. Then you try and get a more professional setup if budget allows, whether that's that you go into a studio, or if budget doesn't allow, you get yourself a little handheld mic. Ideally, you want something that you're not touching, because Whenever you're touching anything, you're always making sounds, and record. Nobody else is going to hear it. Nobody. And when you get to the point where you feel like you've got something that you're actually proud of, then you will not be able to stop yourself making more. You will be so excited, and all you'll want to do is make more episodes. So just hit that button and record, and then listen to yourself.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Listen, thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you so much, Liam. It's been a great session. I thank you. I think there's just been so much in this session for everybody to digest, and so much valuable information. And thank you for that code. Remember, that's, I think, 3 months free for anybody who wants to get started using Acast. Thank you guys for all of your questions as well, of course. And we'll be back. We have a technical session tomorrow with Suntronics, my microphone actually that I have here. I'm not actually using it right now, but I was supposed to be. This is fantastic microphone. So Trevor Coley, the founder of Suntronics, will be here with us tomorrow evening, showing you how to create a great sounding podcast. So make sure you join us then, and Liam will be back with us next week. So really looking forward to that as well. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Liam.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank everybody.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Bye, Susan. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.